All right. Expectations. We hope everybody's joining us and you're with us. Again, if we lose you because of Facebook, we're going to continue to video this, and we'll send the link out to everybody tonight. It'll be on Facebook again tonight also, but we'll send that to your email address so you can see it and you can actually log on if you registered with us. All right, so 45 to 60-minute presentation. We're going to address the protection of faith leaders. So really what we call close protection. So I'll get into that in just a second, and I'm assuming that's why you guys are here to learn, because this is kind of a supplement to your physical protection program that you have in place. We're going to talk about what close protection looks like in a faith-based environment. What does that mean? We're going to get into the fundamentals of that. Like everything else, I try to break this down very, very simply, very, very quickly, so you guys can get the basics of this, take notes, whatever, come back, review it, because you'll have access to it. And so we try to keep it simple like everything. And then at the end of this, we're going to have a Q&A. If there are any questions, send those to Scott. He's monitoring Facebook right now, and he can answer those questions for you. Or he can send the questions to me or ask me at the end of this, and I'll answer those questions for you. Okay? All right. So let's get into, real quick, some definitions. So executive protection, or like close protection operations, or really what we call protective services operations, is a specialized skill in physical security like conducting a risk assessment. And so you need some specialized training to do this, and it's a tough thing if you've never done it, because it's a little bit different than what you normally do. There's some nuances and some skills that are inside close protection operations that you don't see in some of the physical security stuff. So when I go through this presentation, I'm going to use some terms or some words, and so as I use those, I don't want you to be confused, so let me read those off to you real quick. So the advance, I'm getting old, let me put my glasses on so I can see this, is a general term applied to security plans or all security plans, arrangements, and activities by security personnel prior to the arrival of the principal of the person we're protecting. Here it's going to be a faith leader in any given location. The personal security officer, you're going to hear me say PSO. It's just a general name for like the person that is protecting that faith leader. That's the security agent assigned responsibility of providing close protection for that protectee or principal or that faith leader. A PSVA is a personal security vulnerability assessment. That's a comprehensive analysis of all the aspects of that faith leader's lifestyle, and we're going to get into that. The principal, in this case, is going to be the faith leader. That's the person whom we are protecting. We're providing that one-on-one protection for. Protective services, those security measures taken to provide security for that faith leader, to include personal security, site and special event security, in the appropriate application of physical and electronic security measures to reduce risk to that faith leader. And then the threat assessment of those preventative actions taken to identify and minimize risk to the principal. All right? So those are some quick definitions. If I flew through those too quickly, sorry, you can't see them, but I've got braces and I got those adjusted a couple days ago, and my mouth is actually killing me, and I feel like I can't talk. So if you have questions about these definitions, let me know, or send an email to Scott, or send us a message on Facebook, and we'll send you these definitions for later, for purposes for later on if you need them. All right, let me get in real quick to close protection in faith-based organizations or for faith leaders, and what this means. How is this different than it would be as you stand post at your church every Sunday or Wednesday or whenever you have services. So close protection is nothing more than the proximity between you, the person that's providing the protection, and the faith leader, or who we call the principal. Now, again, understand you're providing individual security operations for a faith leader who may be at risk. So this could be your pastor every Sunday because you're in a mega church. This could be a televangelist that you travel with. This could be some sort of an off-site event, and there is a faith leader that shows up, and you're assigned to protect them. And that is your only job, to protect that one person. Someone else is protecting the congregation or those people that are actually watching that event. All right? So to get you to kind of understand this, there are two sides to close protection. And I have managed, so I started close protection operations in the Marine Corps a long time ago because I'm old. When I was assigned to Fast Company, that was one of our missions. I did close protection operations for the mayor's office as an investigator for criminal intelligence section here for Metro Nashville Police Department. I have developed and designed executive protection or close protection programs, managed one last year for an extended amount of time, which I'm really too old to do that kind of stuff, but I did that last year. And currently, in my full-time job as a director of physical security for a big company, Part of that also is me designing and managing an executive protection program when the people that own our company, when they are at risk for whatever reason. So two sides to this to understand it. There's the public sector side, and then there's a private sector side. We, in the faith-based community, are the private sector. And what that means is we don't work for a government. We're not public sector. We don't answer to the government. We're not providing protection for some sort of a government leader. We are in the private sector. So private sectors like us, private executive protection agents, people that work for a company or a private organization providing protection. The public sector is like what you would think about, the U.S. Secret Service, U.S. State Department, U.S. Department of Homeland Security. So those are folks that are doing public sector operations. And that also includes like state troopers that protect governors, and then of course like what I did a long time ago, which is local police officers or like county officers that protect like the mayor or somebody in the office of the mayor. Close protection, just real quick, it's just a fundamental protection technique really, where when we talk about this in the public sector, when that protector, like us, is very close to that faith leader. So in the public sector, a long time ago, they started to call this within arm's reach. There's something called the arm's reach principle, and there's a purpose behind all that and why we do that. Understand public sector techniques are very direct in nature. They're very overt, and the purpose of that is to provide immediate deterrence, and we're going to get into that. So this is an example of like being within arm's reach, close protection. And so the principle behind this, or the idea behind this within arm's reach, would be if there is a threat that is seen in a crowd or somewhere where this principal or protectee or this faith leader is, then someone, a security person, would announce, or they would actually like yell out that threat in the direction where that threat is, and the other agents surrounding that person or protecting in the public sector environment, what they actually do is they cover, so they put their body in front of this person, and then they evacuate that leader. And so you can see real quick, I'll play a video here, and this is when, back in 1981, the attempted assassination on Ronald Reagan. So you're going to see very quickly as he comes out of the hotel, you're going to hear some shots, and then you're going to see the Secret Service, Jerry Parr very specifically, the PSO, that personal security officer that was in charge of protecting him that day in close protection of that proximity. You're going to see him very quickly cover and evacuate President Reagan. So this is what it looks like in the public sector. You guys have seen this on TV. Okay? And this is important to see this so you understand the difference between what we're doing and then the Secret Service. Okay? The environment's very different. The risk is very different. Risk level. And here's the president's out. You're going to see right behind President Reagan there, that gray-haired fellas. That is Jerry Parr, the protective agent saved his life. There's the gunfire, and you saw Jerry Parr very quickly grab Reagan. What you did not see is you did not see him throw him inside the vehicle. Okay? So this is, as you can see, the protectee now was out of the immediate danger. Okay, so that's what a public sector close protection operation is. Now, very different for us if we're protecting faith leaders, and we're going to get into that and why. Okay, so close protection for us in the private sector, faith-based environments, may require indirect protection. And what that means is it's very, very low profile. All right, so we're not going to be really close up and right behind that faith leader. The reason for that is because it's designed to be discreet in nature. All right, it does not draw unnecessary attention to that faith leader or that protectee. And how we use protection here, especially for us, we would use other security personnel on our other layers when we start talking about our concentric rings to provide physical protection. Now again, this is a very, very, very discreet. It's very, very indirect in general. Think about it this way. I've been to a number of the bigger executive protection schools in my career. Bob Oatman, who is a long-time kind of training leader in the industry, still has a very popular school in Maryland. He's got several books out, and he's just a nice fella too. So he's got a lot of books. He's on the Executive Protection Council for the American Society for Industrial Security. And when you go through his residential course, 7-day course, he talks about some of his experiences, and he talks about the difference between direct and indirect protection. He calls it something different. That's what I call it. But anyway, And he mentions this in his books. He was protecting a high-risk individual at one time, and this is when he first, I think, when he first retired from Baltimore County Police Department. He was a lieutenant in their intelligence section, so he was in charge of providing protective services for public officials as a police officer. When he retires or leaves police work and goes into the private sector, he is assigned to protect a high-risk person. And he asked that protectee, hey, you know, this is kind of what I learned in the government sector or public sector. How close do you want me to be to you? Because now this is private. You know, there is a risk to you, but it's not what it was or what I'm used to. And the protectee told him this. He said, hey, I want you to be close enough to protect me, but I don't want you to be so close to where I have to introduce you. Okay? So what that means is when you're seen with your protectee or this faith-based leader, you're not going to be right up on them. You're going to be back enough to where you can see what's going on, and if you need to, get that person out of danger, but you're not going to be on top of them. So number one, so it creates an issue where people think for whatever reason you have to be introduced or you get in that faith-based leader's way. All right, so we're going to stay out of the way and stay just very discreet in general. Okay? So when we start to talk about close protection in faith-based environments, the majority of churches in the United States of America are not going to probably need these services. And what that means is more than likely the pastors or the faith leaders at that church, or maybe even your church, are not going to need close-in protection. The risk level does not, it doesn't call for such protection measures. Now, you might do it anyway. One thing that I do, that I see, or what we see by Michael Mann Security Services, when we talk to other security teams or we go in, we're asked to come in to do training, even if it's a small church, sometimes we see where there is a security person or like a security volunteer that is assigned to, for whatever reason, to protect a pastor, even if they're not at risk or at high risk for an attack. And it's because there's a belief that that's something that church security is supposed to do. Understand close protection, and what we're talking about today, protective services, is designed when there is an elevated risk level to that faith leader, to that pastor, to that televangelist, whoever it is. So the majority of churches in the U.S. are not going to require this. Here's places where we've seen where it's required. So like mega churches, big churches, 2,500 plus folks, the pastor is well known, and because they're well known and because they broadcast on TV or on the internet or whatever every weekend or every week, what happens is they receive threats and they are at a higher risk level. All right. So big mega churches, traveling ministries. So an example would be like Beth Moore. Beth Moore has, not all the time, but there is a security person assigned to her when she travels and when she takes her ministry on the road. So there's somebody assigned to security that you probably, I mean, I don't watch her videos, but you probably don't see him or that person while she's up on stage. And so, but she does have somebody assigned to her when she's traveling. Televangelists, and then high-profile pastors. When we talk about ministries, if you watched our webinar from last week, our protecting houses of worship from acts of terrorism, we talked about the FRC attack in Washington, D.C. back in 2012, so that Family Research Council. The president, Tony Perkins of FRC, after that attack in 2012, was assigned what they call, I think it's like the president's assistant or executive assistant, but that is a security person. I met him last year at a Southern Baptist event in downtown Nashville where I was assisting with security. And so after that attack, he was assigned someone for close protection. Now, again, it's indirect. You don't see him, just like with the security person with Beth Moore and a lot of the other high-profile faith leaders, but again, they are there. And so, again, the majority of churches probably won't need this level of protection for their faith leaders, but it does exist, and we're going to talk about it. All right? All right, so let's get into the fundamentals of what this looks like, the stuff that breaks us down, makes it easy for you guys. Number one, this is the most important fundamental in the 6 or 7 fundamentals I threw in here for you guys to be able to understand what we're talking about. We talk about protective services. So number one, identify and understand the threat to your faith leader. So at a minimum, if you're trying to introduce this or you believe that you need protective services for your faith leader, you wanted to conduct a threat assessment. And that threat assessment are those preventative actions taken to identify and minimize risk to that principle of that faith leader. Remember, risk is always threat. So what is the threat? Who is the threat? the vulnerability, which is the system weaknesses, what are we not doing, and the consequence or impact to your faith leader if this attack were to happen. So you're going to look at a threat assessment. So what you're focusing on here in the beginning is the threat. What does that look like? Who is the threat? What is the threat? Has this happened in the past? What level are we at? And so, what does that look like? At what risk level are they? And so if that's the case, at what level of protection do they need, and do we need to do this? So that's the purpose of the threat assessment. Another thing that the threat assessment is going to tell you is, if you're already conducting these operations and you put them in place before you did any kind of an assessment, it's going to tell you, are the protective measures necessary, or are the suggested protective measures necessary? Do you need to be doing what you're doing based on the level of the threat? And are you using your available resources wisely? Even large megachurches, there are a limited amount of resources. And if we are part of the security ministry, whether we're close protection or we're part of the bigger program that's outstanding post, doing other security work throughout the week for that ministry, we need to use what we have very wisely. All right? The money does not belong to us. That money belongs to God. So another part of our threat assessment is to determine if we're using those resources and those funds wisely. All right? So I went and just did a quick, like a snapshot threat risk assessment using some of the information I've already talked to you about with you guys on some of these other webinars. So in last week's webinar, the terrorism webinar, I gave you a number of attacks that have happened from like 2017 into 2018, terrorism attacks against churches in the U.S. I think we determined they were 10 or 11. There were a number of others that were listed, but those were attacks where they were arson attacks, and there were no suspects. Nobody claimed responsibility, so we omitted those attacks from that list, from that list or that online resource where we got the information. So when I looked at those terrorist attacks, 2017, 2018, and when I go back on the attacks of houses of worship from 2000 to 2018 that the FBI actually compiles, when I break all those attacks down, not one that I can find specifically targeted a pastor or a faith leader. Even the attack in 2012 on FRC was not specifically targeted for the president of the Family Research Council. It was opportunistic in general. So what that means is, let's talk about targeted and opportunistic. Targeted means I'm going to come after your pastor specifically because of something he has said, or because something he has done, or something he's involved with, and the harm that I want to introduce is to that pastor. So I'm targeting that faith leader. Opportunistic means I'm going to go in and attack whoever's available. Whatever target of opportunity is there, that's exactly what I'm going to go after. So even the FRC attack was opportunistic violence. It was not a targeted attack on the president, okay, of that organization. And so when I look at the threat assessment as a snapshot threat assessment, and we talk about risk and we talk about close protection operations, none of the attacks, the active shooter attacks or the terrorist attacks had any information where a pastor specifically was targeted. Now there was one attack in Alabama. I think it happened in 2015, where the pastor tried to intervene on a violent event where a gentleman stood up and shot his wife and shot his child in that service. It was considered to be an active shooter event. And when that pastor tried to intervene to stop, he was shot, but not because he was targeted, because he got in the way of the shooter to try to save the girl and the child. And in that process, he was injured. Okay? So again, pastors and faith leaders were not directly targeted. So when I'm looking at the information that we have, the churches are probably at a low risk. And that doesn't mean if you're at a mega church, you're providing close protection now for some sort of televangelist, or you're doing that for some other ministry. You might have already received threats, or you've gotten threats very specifically toward that faith leader, and you need to be doing this. I'm just letting you know about the open source information and what I looked at, the case studies, what that snapshot threat assessment looks like. Okay? All right. Here is something. So we talk about mega churches, we talk about traveling ministries, we talk about televangelists, people at high risk. If you do determine that there may be a high threat risk level or a high risk level, what you might want to consider is a personal security vulnerability assessment, or PSVA. So this goes beyond that typical basic threat assessment or risk assessment. Here's what this is. This is an assessment of both the workplace the faith leader's home and when they travel. All right, so what you're doing is you're looking at overall risk at those different locations to try to decide what protective measures you're going to put into place. So you determine what level of security is required, again, for their home, the church, if they're a church leader or a faith leader at a church, transportation when they go to and from these locations, any kind of remote speaking engagements, very specifically if they're on the road ministry, and of course mission trips also. So you're trying to determine that threat and that risk level at all locations where these folks are. So that's a PSVA. And again, that's probably for megachurches, traveling ministries, and high-profile principals or faith leaders. Probably not for the standard pastor in the church with 500 people, or the average church in the U.S. All right. So we've talked about threat, and we're going to continue to talk about threat. And in that same category, let's talk about what it is you're trying to protect that faith leader from. So we call these protection objectives. And so your first protection objective is that protection from intentional harm. So that intentional harm, which is something that's caused by a human or human caused, we're talking about things like assassination, we're talking about like kidnappings, or maybe even a victim of opportunistic violence like the FRC attack in 2012. So again, we've talked about this at length, so we won't get into it. But again, the case study Family Resource Council attack in 2012. If you go back to last week's webinar, I broke that attack down in a timeline. So when that adversary decided to attack, how he got the information to attack FRC, why he wanted to attack FRC and some other ministries, how he conducted hostile surveillance operations, how he conducted rehearsal, and what the attack actually looked like. So that timeline and a very detailed case study is in last week's webinar. And again, I think we call that Protecting Houses of Worship from Acts of Terrorism. So you can go on our website, michaelmannsecurityservices.com, and you can see that detailed case study to kind of get an example of opportunistic violence. All right? So unintentional harm, our next objective, our protection objective, is going to be protecting that faith leader from unintentional harm. So this is what this means. This is where we go in to look at the age, the medical history, and the personal habits of a faith leader. Now, unintentional harms are going to be things like medical emergencies, slips, trips, and falls, motor vehicle accidents. Medical emergencies, very specifically because, and we've talked about this before, if you believe what the CDC tells us, so even if you go to statistics before COVID-19, the 3 leading causes of death in the United States of America is not by gunfire, it's by heart disease, it's from cancer, and it's from like accidents. And so because of that, when we start to think about unintentional harm, the likely threat to that faith leader is going to be unintentional harm when we start to look at this. And so as a PSO, or as that security person assigned to provide close protection for that faith leader, we want to be skilled in this stuff, or our response anyway to this, to be able to deal with that problem. So we always think about the intentional harm, having the pistol, like jumping up in front of the principal and taking a bullet for him. Well, more than likely, especially in our environment, we're probably not going to have to do that. But here's what we might have to do. We might have to give CPR. We might have to go get an AED. We might have to pick our faith leader up because they tripped over something. We might have to respond if they're in some sort of a motor vehicle accident. Or when we start talking about their lifestyle, based on their lifestyle, we might have to intervene and do something because of an unintentional injury. I've got down here an example of George Bush. And so many years ago, I worked as a police officer with a female police officer who later left Metro Nashville and went to U.S. Secret Service. She was an outstanding police officer, and she's an outstanding U.S. Secret Service agent. She graduated top of her class at U.S. Secret Service Academy, and she was very quickly assigned to protection. And I remember right before 9/11, I was at a training class out at the airport in Nashville, Tennessee. We were going through doing some terrorism training, and Clinton was the president at the time. It was right before the election of George Bush. And she was coming to do the advance. I saw her, hadn't seen her in a couple of years because she had left Metro and was at the Secret Service. Got to talk to her. We were talking about protection. And later on, several years later, as I went into the private sector, was design security programs, I was at an executive protection school and met a medical professional that knows her. Very specifically knows a partner of hers that she works with the Secret Service. And we started talking about her. And I found out that because she's a very physically fit young lady, She was one of the few Secret Service agents, from what I was told, that could actually keep up with George Bush on the run. George Bush was a big runner. And the Secret Service, when he would run, when he would exercise daily, a lot of them had trouble keeping up with him. She could keep up with George Bush. And so, again, because of personal habits, there are things that we may have to be involved with. And I'm not saying you got to go run 3 miles with your pastor, but it's an example of an agent assigned to someone based on personal habits and because of a skill they have, something they have to be involved with to make sure there's not an unintentional injury. And they're not only protecting the president when he's on the run, obviously, from some sort of intentional harm, but it could be unintentional like this, like a medical emergency, a heart issue, a cardiac issue, something like that. So again, this is something that we're probably going to have to deal with, very much more likely than some sort of an intentional threat. Okay? And then we talk about protection from embarrassment. All right? This is our last objective in personal protection. And so what we're talking about here are personal issues that are brought into the spotlight about our faith leader. Now, understand, okay, what I'm about to tell you is we're not, as protectors, we don't conceal sinful activity. But understand when you're providing close protection for a faith leader or some high-profile person anywhere in the protection industry, understand there are things that you're going to see and you're going to hear that the rest of the folks around that person or the public does not see or hear. And so understand when you start to provide these kind of protection operations, even to faith leaders, especially if you're at a megachurch, you're doing this for a traveling ministry, you're doing this for somebody that's very, very high profile, there may be a non-disclosure agreement in place, there may be some other things that you agreed to before you took this assignment on. They're going to keep you from saying things or communicating things that may occur. Okay? So understand, one thing we talk about embarrassment might be sinful activity. It happens with faith leaders. And again, we're not talking about concealing that. We're just providing that as an example of something that could happen and then your involvement with it. What does that mean as a protector? This could be also something that you do or that I do as a protective agent. Something that we do that might embarrass that faith leader. A good example, I'm going to show you a video, is Joyce Meyer. If you don't know who she is, she's a televangelist. She's got her own show. I don't know if she still travels. I don't know much about her ministry. But several years ago, she hired a bodyguard. Now, there's a difference between a bodyguard and a protective agent. This guy's like a bodyguard. He was married guy, 3 kids, was paid 6 figures to protect this faith leader. And at some point decides he wants to leave his wife. He starts having an affair with a woman that was actually friends with his wife, and he sets it up to make it look like it was somebody else that killed him. He murders his wife, and he murders his children in their home, leaves to go work out, calls a neighbor who happens to be a police officer to kind of set this thing up to where the police officer goes in, discovers their bodies, and then claims that, of course, they were alive when he left. They figured out, obviously, he was not telling the truth. He was charged with their murder, and that is online. And this was in it, so you can see the story. I'm going to play you a video here in just a second. You have to understand that I'm sure this was a huge embarrassment to Joyce Meyer, because I know, because you're going to see it, she ended up having to talk on newscasts. I'm sure she had to testify at trial. So it was an embarrassment to the faith leader and to the ministry. So when we talk about embarrassment, it could be something that the faith leader's involved with, and it could be something that we do. And we try to stay completely away from that. So here is just something that embarrassed the ministry. It had a huge impact on her ministry, and I'm sure it had a personal impact on her, according to all the information I read about this fella. His father is a former pastor, and they were friends with Joyce Meyer. So it's one of the reasons I think he got the job. So she knew him. They were friends. This happens. He murders his family, and so there was a huge impact to the ministry. Play the video for you here real quick. Man, when it's on Nancy Grace, you know you're in trouble, okay? All right.
Myers of Worldwide Joyce Myers Ministry says she's praying. Good to know. I'm glad she's praying. Somebody needs to pray. The entire family of her employee found strangled in their own beds. Since then, he has quit his job with Joyce Myers Ministries. Back out to you, Nick Pister, St. Louis Post-Dispatch. Which policy did he violate in order to get fired or leave or resign?
We don't know what policy it was. We know that we're not even sure what exactly all the policies are for the international televangelist Joyce Meyer, but we do know that he traveled extensively with her and that at some points he would meet up with a woman who police sources say is his girlfriend.
Okay, is that the, as you say, exotic dancer?
Yes.
Okay, speaking of the exotic dancer slash stripper, Pister, is this a woman that actually knew his wife way back when?
Yes, she went to high school with his wife.
Repeat.
She went to high school with...
Okay, that's enough of that video. You get the idea. This is an embarrassment to that ministry. You can go online, you can read all about this attack and about this case, and you can see his interview online, and when the police started to question him, question the girl that he was having the affair with, and then of course the process of them deciding and figuring out that of course he was the suspect or the perpetrator in this event. So when we talk about protection from embarrassment, go to something just a little bit different. So what you're about to see is this is an example, a great example of how protective agents or how a PSO or someone like yourself, if you're assigned to a faith leader, how you can save your faith leader from embarrassment. So what I'm about to show you is a video of Hillary Clinton, and you're going to hear some stuff before the video. It's somebody talking about they think she's got some kind of medical issue. But in 2016 at the 9/11 memorial, I think it was in D.C., Hillary Clinton's there. She's got her Secret Service detail, whether she was obviously at that time. Before that, she's Secretary of State, and of course at this time she was running. About to start running against Donald Trump for the office of president. She's at this memorial, and she ends up having some sort of a medical issue. Now the medical issue, I'm sure, because it was hot. She's an old lady. She's mean as a snake. So for whatever reason, she passes out, or she kind of starts to lose her footing. I want you to see what the Secret Service does. This is an excellent example of protectors and how they get around her and how they stop her from falling and cover her and get her in the vehicle to try to keep, number one, from being a medical emergency. Number two, so the media doesn't get all over it. They did, but still they're doing their best to try to keep that from happening. And also they're doing this, obviously, so she doesn't get embarrassed. Okay? So a really good example here.
Hi, this is William Ramsey. Today, September 11th, 2016, Hillary Clinton collapsed at a 9/11 memorial. I have video of the event from 3 angles. Here's the first angle. You can see her strange, black, modified van pull up, but watch her right here in the center. Her handlers pick her up and forcibly put her into the van. Here it is in slow motion. You can see her knees buckle as they pick her up and barely get her into the van. Watch her head drop.
All right. So a good example of, again, how a protective agent does something to keep that faith leader or that person you're protecting from embarrassing themselves or falling into an embarrassing situation. Again, a lot of speculation during the election. She was sick and she wouldn't be able to handle the office, and everybody was coming up with all kinds of reasons why she's passed out or almost passed out. Look like more than likely, the heat and probably her age. All right, so it happens to all of us. But again, a good example of the professionalism of really, really good, outstanding protective agents, U.S. Secret Service. So that's when we talk about threats. So understand our threat, identify it, understand it. Now we're going to talk about maintain your ability. So at some point, if you're doing these kind of physical protection operations, you're going to have to maintain your ability to do this. And here's what this means. There are, again, unlike, you've heard me say this before, unlike other security operations where we really can't measure deterrence. So if I'm protecting a nuclear site and I've got, 200 very well armed, security police officers in armored cars with, fully automatic weapons and hand grenades and cameras and alarm systems and big fences and walls, Deterrence, we don't worry about it, and we don't measure it in our vulnerability assessments because it doesn't matter because of our response functions and the detection and delay functions that we have built in. As a protective agent, you don't have any of that. So if you're protecting a faith leader, more than likely you're going to be by yourself, or the people that are assisting, they're on an outer perimeter standing outside the church or in a hallway. They're not going to be close to you. It's you. So deterrence is a big factor here. We can't measure it, but you've got to show that you're able to protect this person. Now, that doesn't mean you have to be 25 years old, that you have to be a Navy SEAL, that you have to bench press 500 pounds, but there's going to be some ability. Number one is that mental ability, the ability to stay plugged in and watch for those threats we're going to get into here shortly, to be able to identify those early and be able to deal with those. So staying mentally sharp, that's an ability when we start to do close protection operations, even if it's indirect, even if we're not at arm's length with the principal or the protectee. We have to be able to identify a threat early, and that mentally is draining if you've never done that work. I've done that work. I did it as a young man. I've done it as an old man, and I don't want to do it again. I manage that now, but I let young guys do it. Young, good-looking guys, big, stocky guys, they like to do that kind of stuff. It is mentally exhausting to go out somewhere, or even if you're on stage, to pay attention, looking for a threat or a potential threat, and be ready to protect that faith leader. So mentally, it's a very exhaustive thing. So there has to be some mental ability for you to be able to be plugged in and do this for an extended amount of time. There is physical ability. Now, you don't need to go run 30 miles a week, don't need to lift a bunch of weights, but you need to have some kind of routine that's going to keep you in some sort of a condition to be able to conduct those operations. Okay? So based on however much time you're spending with your faith leader, depending on what that risk is, you determine what that routine's supposed to look like. Okay. Then we talk about the technical side. This one of the reasons we put this in the beginning of the presentation: training. So this is a skill that deteriorates quickly, and a lot of people I've run into in this industry that do this type of work, not just in faith-based organizations, but very specifically in the private sector, they're doing this full time. They don't get a lot of training, and here's why. Number one, because close protection training is expensive. The schools, especially the recognized schools, are costly. Number two, it takes a while to be able to understand this and do it effectively. So you're going to have to go to more than one training school. So you've got to keep up technical ability. And again, that's why we provide this type of stuff, and we provide some other low-cost training to teach people how to do this. So there's going to be mental ability, your ability to stay plugged in to look for threats. Physical ability, your ability to be able to stand up there for an extended amount of time, because you're not going to be sitting down. You're going to have to be standing up, looking at that immediate area to make sure that you're protecting that faith leader. And that technical ability is going to be the training that you need, or the training that you have to receive to be able to do your job. Okay? Again, that faith leader is depending on you to protect them. There is no one else. It's just you, more than likely. Okay? And remember, if you're up there on stage or you're close, you represent that ministry. So I want to show everyone else that we have the ability to do our job. Again, you're representing that ministry, especially if you're working directly for the ministry or directly for that faith leader. Okay? Number three, protective operations complements your existing program. This is something that enhances, or it's an enhanced skill that complements what you already have in place. So if you do have somebody assigned to your pastor, okay, it's part of your physical protection operation that you already have in place. Those folks that are standing post outside the worship center, outside the children's ministry, at the doors, it complements that program. Okay. Again, we talk about training standards for that. We talked about the CPS certification. Again, something else we provide. But again, to be able to do that, to be able to make sure this complements what you have in place, those folks out standing post also have to be trained and certified. They also have to have some kind of skill, some kind of ability. Number four, planning is the key to success. If you've had any executive protection or close protection training, we all know that the advance of that planning is always the most important, even in faith-based environments. Bob Oatman says this in his books. If you ever go to any of his training seminars, whether it's his 2-day, you go to the 7-day resident program in Maryland, you're going to hear this comment. It is not about the gun, it's about the advance. A gun is a tool of response. More than likely, you're never going to use a gun in protective operations, especially if you're doing your job. The planning that you put into place to make sure that that protection is available for that faith leader happens before you get on that stage with that person, or before you're backstage in the green room, or before you get on that airplane, or before you get in that car or go on that mission trip. All that happens before that faith leader ever gets there. This is protection. And so people think about jumping in front of bullets and carrying guns. Truthfully, to be successful in this is about what you do 2 weeks before, 3 days before, 2 hours before. So everything is about the planning. Coordination of all necessary security arrangements for you guys that are doing this at a church. That could be slips, trips, and falls. Hey, before the pastor gets up on stage, you're looking around to make sure that there's not anything that the AV team missed, to make sure that he or she does not trip over that cord and cause a medical emergency. Location of AEDs. We went back to, hey, what's their age? What are their personal habits? Hey, look, if it's an older person, or they have like medical history, if they have an issue of hearts, like some sort of cardiac issue, you need to know where the AED is, or you need to have one with you. So that may be some planning that you do every Sunday. Emergency exit. Man, if there's a problem, where do I need to get the pastor out? Where does that happen? And it could be it's a fire. It doesn't mean someone's going to attack them. But if the place catches on fire or something bad happens, how do I get them out? Where's the nearest exit? Water bottles, extra AV equipment. Look, they get up there, they're preaching, they're talking, doing whatever they're doing their thing. They may need water, they run out of it. It may be your job to go up there and make sure that there's water bottles in place, because you're in close proximity to this faith leader. Or, like if their battery pack runs out and the AV misses it, you might have extra gear there for them. So this is planning, okay? And when we start to talk about that, basic questions. Number one, what's the threat and what can happen? What are you trying to protect the faith leader against, and what can happen? What's that worst case scenario? What is your plan? What does that mean? What's the plan if this happens? Do you have the resources to carry out your plan? It's one thing to have a plan in place, but if I don't have the resources to follow through, what's the point? So not only what's the plan, but do we have the availability of resources to follow through with it? Who are we coordinating with? If you're on a traveling ministry, or your pastor travels, like so you're going to different churches, there may be other security people or other people you're going to have to deal with. Who are you going to have to coordinate with? How do you get a hold of them? What does that look like? And then, of course, you need to ask the question at all times, always, what am I missing? What have I not thought of? Like, run this by another agent, another security person, a leader inside the ministry. Peer check. Ask them to peer check your plan. Look at it. What is it, something that you missed? Is there something there that you did not put into place that's going to cause some sort of unnecessary risk to the faith leader? Okay? All right. Number 5, your protective measures need to be commensurate with the threat. Here's what this means. What is the threat and what are the protective measures? Do the measures exceed the threat level? So, look, we go to churches and we see people that are assigned to protect the pastor, and I'll ask the question, have there been threats against the pastor? And a lot of times the answer we get is no. If you want to do that, that's fine. But if you put enhanced protection measures in place and there is no risk or there is no threat, at some point what this can cause is embarrassment. Okay? Not to say if you're standing up there with your pastor every week that embarrasses that person, but if you've got enhanced measures in place and there's no reason for that, or the risk level doesn't call for it, or the threat level, at some point that might cause an embarrassing situation for that faith leader. We call this the hammer theory. All right, and you guys have heard this before. If I've got a toolbox and the only thing I got in the toolbox is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. So this is what we talk about in church security and guns. Everybody thinks about security is about guns, and it's really not. And if the only tool that you have in a toolbox is a gun, everything that you look at, you're going to think about is how I respond with that gun. When really, to protect folks, we don't need that. So kind of think about the hammer theory when we start to talk about, are your security measures commensurate with that threat? And again, we talked about already protection objectives. They could cause embarrassment. Funny video, just real quick. Stop me from talking. This is a foreign made, but it's funny. This is a protective agent that's protecting a supermodel. She's getting out somewhere on a photo shoot, and something happens, and he kind of goes overboard. And it's really funny. Again, looks like this is from Russia or somewhere in the Ukraine, and so it's a good video for you guys to watch to understand what it looks like when you might embarrass your faith leader. If you go overboard, what could happen? So again, there's a little comic relief behind this, but it's a great video to watch. I don't know what that says, but I think that's a funny video. So he kind of went overboard, very quickly realized he's gone overboard, and then, of course, he's embarrassed his protectee. All right, number 6, this is outside, obviously, of identifying the threat. This is the second most important fundamental in protection. Early detection of adversary activity is a requirement for you to protect your principal. The job of protection is about seeing something before it happens and preventing it. So, long time ago, I mean, it's still around, there's a threat assessment technique called contemporary threat management. It was designed and developed by a couple of mental health professionals that at one time were protectors. They were law enforcement professionals that provided protection for judges, for federal judges specifically. They went into mental health, became psychologists and psychiatrists, and they started to study like predatory behavior, like how to help organizations and protectors identify threats early. And they've written a number of books. I've read their books on very specifically on predatory behavior, and this is what they call it, and I'll explain this: hunters versus howlers. So a hunter is going to be somebody that's going to follow through with a threat. That's someone who wants to attack your faith leader or hurt your faith leader. They're going to follow through with it. A howler is someone that makes a lot of noise. And here's something they talk about in one of their books. Hunters do not howl, and howlers rarely hunt. Okay? And so when we go back and we look at information that we've gotten from the State Department and earlier, like studies that are over 20 years old from the U.S. Secret Service, here's what we know about assassins. Assassins do not directly communicate to the target that they're going to conduct an attack. Go back again to the FRC attack from 2012 in last week's webinar, and in that timeline, that adversary never communicated to anybody at FRC he was going to attack anybody. He didn't announce it anywhere. He went online, he did research. He conducted hostile surveillance, actually got into the building not only the day that he was conducting surveillance in his rehearsal, but also on the day of the attack. He figured out how to get access into a secure location. He did not threaten anybody. He didn't make any communication with that target at any time. And so understand that the bad guy is not going to communicate to us as the protective agent, and more than likely they're not going to communicate to your faith leader that they want to harm them, because hunters don't do that. All right, not generally. Predatory behavior, and that's what we're talking about with hunters, it is always premeditated, it is always planned. I want to see that activity before it happens to prevent it. That process looks like this. When we start talking about conducting these assessments, we're looking for activity, especially when we're that leader, if we haven't detected early. Conflict avoidance. So number one, whatever are the protective measures that we put into place, that's not going to conflict with the mission of the church or the organization. Number two, we need to understand as protectors what is normal in our environment, or what is expected. What do we expect to happen when we're on stage with that protectee or that faith leader, or when we're traveling with them, or when we're wherever we're at, whatever location with that protectee? What is expected and what normally happens? You need to know how to do that. That's exactly what our Israeli security concept teaches you. Number three, the process of threat elimination. There is a process to eliminate what is not going to be a threat when you are standing on post, based on going back to what is expected in your environment. So you take the things away that are not going to be a threat, so you can look specifically for that threat. Number four, you're going to define what we call the adversary attack methodology. What does it look like when that adversary is going through that attack process? The next thing is you're going to look for body language, and what does that mean? How does that body language correspond with that potential attack? And then, of course, you're going to go through a validation process. This is what we call a snapshot like threat assessment. And again, we teach this in a number of courses. All right? So requirement, early detection of adversary activity outside of knowing the threat is the most important element in providing close protection operations or protection for that high-risk faith leader. All right, we talked about this last week. I've talked about this in numerous seminars. Understand, and this gets back into that early detection, the adversary needs four things to protect your faith leader, or to attack your faith leader. He needs to know information about your faith leader. He can get that online, or she can get that online. He actually needs to visit the target and conduct surveillance. So he has to get information about your faith leader and the location where you are. He has to have, or she has to have, the element of surprise. The attack has to be unexpected. He or she has to be mobile, which means they have to be able to move around while they're conducting the attack. And of course, they have to be in control. And control means most of the time a weapon. They have to be able to get some sort of a weapon inside that protected environment to conduct that attack. So anytime I can take any of this away, that reduces that risk or almost eliminates that risk of that attack. And very specifically, when we are situationally aware and we know what we're looking for, it takes away the element of surprise, which again can reduce this threat greatly. Okay? We've talked about this. Prevention is always the key to success. Our job is not to respond. Our job is to prevent. Prevention is always about intelligence, and when we talk about close protection operations, it's about deterrence. Our ability, and this goes back to our physical, right, our mental, and our technical abilities. Deterrence is our ability to convince that adversary that our faith leader is going to be too hard of a target to attack because we are there protecting. Okay? You've heard this many times from me. All right, folks, any questions that we had come up during this? This is one of our longer webinars, so we're at an hour. No questions? Good. All right. Folks, please, if you have them, contact us at michaelmannsecurityservices.com. Go to the website. You can also get us at Scott M, SCOTTM, at michaelmannsecurityservices.com. Again, you can reach us on Facebook at Safe with Mann, or I hope you can. It sounds like we made it okay. We had some technical difficulties in the beginning, but it looks like Facebook didn't cut us off, so that's good. So you can get us on Facebook or Instagram at Safe with Mann. And then, of course, at any time, you can call Scott at 615-606-1006. The later, the better. His wife, Carrie, and his children would appreciate that greatly. So make sure it's after 10 o'clock at night. All right, folks, that's all we have for today. Our longest webinar so far, it's in an hour. We appreciate you tuning in. Had a lot of folks register. Hope you got something out of today's webinar. Email us or call us about questions or any concerns that you have. Go to our webpage under Training and Resources to see what we have coming up very specifically and some stuff that's going to address this threat detection that we talked about in the seminar. And remember, it's about prevention, not response.